In this episode, we're going to tighten the link between what an organization cares about and what the SOC actually alerts on by focusing on actionable alerts built from use cases and observable attacker behaviors. Beginners often hear use case and think it means a vague statement like detect malware or prevent breaches, but ASOC cannot alert on broad wishes. It alerts on specific, observable patterns that appear in the telemetry you collect, and those patterns must be connected to risk in a way that makes human action reasonable. The phrase observable attacker behaviors matters because it keeps you grounded in what can be seen, like authentication anomalies, privilege changes, process execution, unusual connections, and sensitive data access patterns. When alerts are not tied to observable behavior, they become opinionated warnings that analysts cannot confirm, and when they are not tied to use cases, they become technical noise that does not map to business impact. The goal here is to show you how to translate a use case into a behavior hypothesis, choose the right evidence, and package it so a person can quickly decide what to do next. By the end, you should be able to recognize what makes an alert actionable and why behavior-driven design produces better outcomes than one-off event triggers. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Start by clarifying what a use case looks like when it is ready to become an alert, because not every use case should produce an alert in its first form. A useful use case is a statement about a risk you want to detect or a decision you want to make, such as identify suspicious account takeover attempts, detect unauthorized privilege escalation, or detect abnormal access to sensitive data. The key is that the use case implies a specific outcome if it is true, like an account may be compromised or a system may be under active manipulation. To move from use case to alert, you restate it as a behavior hypothesis that can be tested with data, such as an account performed a login from an unusual source and then accessed a sensitive system, which is inconsistent with its normal pattern. This hypothesis framing is powerful because it makes the alert about evidence rather than about fear. It also ensures the alert can be investigated, because a hypothesis can be confirmed or disproved. For beginners, this is the first big leap. ASOC alert is not a general warning. It is a hypothesis about behavior that deserves validation. Observable attacker behaviors are often multi-step, and this is why good alerts usually combine signals rather than firing on a single event. A single failed login is common and usually benign, but repeated failures followed by a success might indicate password guessing or credential stuffing. A single permission change might be part of routine administration, but a permission change followed shortly by unusual access to new systems might indicate privilege misuse. A single outbound connection might be normal, but an outbound connection to an unfamiliar destination immediately after suspicious execution activity on an endpoint is a stronger indicator of compromise. Multi-step behaviors can be observed by correlating events across time and across sources, which is where your earlier collection and enrichment work becomes essential. When you build alerts around sequences, you reduce false positives because you are looking for patterns that are less likely to occur by accident. You also increase actionability because the pattern itself suggests a response, such as validating the account, isolating the endpoint, or investigating recent changes. For the exam, recognizing that behavior patterns are more meaningful than isolated events is a core detection design skill. To create actionable alerts, you need to select evidence that is both relevant and dependable, which means it should come from sources that are authoritative for the behavior you are observing. Authentication behavior should rely on identity and access telemetry that accurately records successes, failures, and context like source and method. Execution behavior should rely on endpoint telemetry that shows processes, scripts, and changes to persistence or security settings. Network behavior should rely on connection telemetry that describes where a system communicated and whether the pattern is unusual. Data access behavior should rely on application or storage audit telemetry that identifies what was accessed and by whom. The most common beginner mistake is to build alerts from low-quality evidence, such as generic messages that lack key fields, because those alerts cannot be investigated quickly. Another mistake is to rely on a single perspective, like network only, when the use case demands a combination of identity, endpoint, and application signals to be convincing. Actionability improves when evidence can be cross-checked, because analysts gain confidence faster when multiple sources agree on the story. Selecting dependable evidence is what makes an alert defensible rather than speculative. Once you select evidence sources, you need to decide what exactly the alert should say, because an alert is communication, not just computation. A strong alert statement describes the behavior in plain terms and includes the minimal facts needed for triage, such as the identity involved, the asset involved, the time window, and the reason it is suspicious. The reason should be explicit, such as unusual location for this account, unusual access target for this role, or unusual sequence of actions compared to baseline. The alert should also include pivot points, such as user identifiers, device identifiers, and relevant network attributes, so the analyst can quickly gather more context. For beginners, it helps to think of the alert as the top paragraph of an incident report, because it should summarize what matters without forcing the reader to reconstruct the story from scratch. If the alert cannot be understood quickly, it is already failing, because confusion creates delay and inconsistent handling. The goal is to make the first 5 minutes of triage efficient and consistent, which is what actionability really means in practice. Alert actionability also depends on scope, meaning how narrowly or broadly the alert fires, and beginners often get this wrong by aiming too broad. If an alert fires for many unrelated situations, analysts cannot develop consistent handling habits, and the alert becomes a noisy bucket that mixes true and false positives. Narrow scope does not mean missing threats, because it means defining the behavior pattern clearly and attaching it to a use case that has an expected response. For example, an alert about impossible travel might be scoped to privileged accounts or to access to sensitive systems, because those cases justify urgent attention. An alert about a new administrative account might be scoped to systems that should have tightly controlled administration, because that increases confidence and impact. Scoping can also use enrichment, such as targeting production environments or high criticality assets, because that aligns the alert with business risk. When scope is well chosen, analysts can build muscle memory for triage and response, and tuning becomes easier because outcomes are more consistent. Broad alerts often feel reassuring at first, but they degrade quickly into noise that no one trusts. Another key design choice is severity and prioritization, which should be tied to both confidence and impact, not just to scary-sounding behaviors. Confidence is how likely it is that the observed pattern represents malicious or risky activity, based on the evidence quality and the specificity of the behavior. Impact is what would happen if the behavior is truly malicious, based on what systems and identities are involved and what actions occurred. A high-confidence, low-impact alert might still be important, but it might be handled with a less urgent workflow than a high-confidence, high-impact alert. A low-confidence, high-impact pattern might be tracked or enriched rather than escalated immediately, because it could create waste if it fires too often. Beginners often think severity is a simple ranking, but in effective alerting it is the result of reasoning about evidence and business context. Enrichment is what makes this reasoning possible, because it tells you whether an identity is privileged and whether an asset is critical. When severity reflects confidence and impact, the SOC can spend attention where it matters most. Building alerts from attacker behaviors also benefits from thinking about common tactics, even without memorizing a full framework, because tactics suggest what observables to combine. Access-related behaviors suggest combining authentication anomalies with unusual device or location context. Persistence-related behaviors suggest combining changes to startup mechanisms with unusual execution patterns. Privilege-related behaviors suggest combining group membership changes with subsequent administrative actions. Movement-related behaviors suggest combining new remote connections with unusual authentication paths and new destination systems. Exfiltration-related behaviors suggest combining unusual access to sensitive stores with unusual outbound transfers. The point is not to label tactics in your head, but to recognize that meaningful behaviors often show up as linked signals across different telemetry types. This is also why collection and enrichment programs often prioritize identity, endpoint, and key network signals first because they support many behavior patterns. When you design alerts with this multi-signal mindset, you create signals that are more resilient to attackers who try to blend in. You also create alerts that tell a more coherent story, which accelerates human decision-making. Actionability also depends on providing guidance on what the next validation step should be, even if you do not include a full response procedure. An alert should suggest what evidence the analyst should check next, such as reviewing recent activity for the same identity, checking whether the device has other suspicious execution events, or checking whether there were recent privilege changes. This can be as simple as including the relevant time window and identifiers that make those checks easy. The reason this matters is that analysts handle many alerts, and the fastest alerts are the ones that immediately point to a clear validation path. Without that, analysts may either over-escalate out of caution or under-investigate out of fatigue, and both outcomes reduce security effectiveness. The exam often tests this indirectly by asking what additional evidence would be needed to confirm a suspicion, which is the same thinking you use when deciding what an alert should include. A well-designed alert is not just a trigger, it is the start of a structured reasoning process. Another area to keep in mind is how alerts interact with noise and tuning, because behavior-based alerts still require refinement over time. Even a well-designed behavior pattern can fire on legitimate activity if the environment has business processes that mimic the pattern, like large scheduled data exports or administrative changes during maintenance. This is where feedback loops matter, because each alert outcome teaches you whether your assumptions about normal behavior were correct and whether enrichment is sufficient to distinguish normal from abnormal. Sometimes the fix is adjusting thresholds, sometimes it is adding a context condition, and sometimes it is improving data quality or enrichment so the behavior can be understood correctly. The danger is tuning by simply suppressing alerts without understanding why they fired, because that can hide real attacks that share the same pattern. Better tuning aims to preserve the detection goal while reducing avoidable false positives through specificity and context. For beginners, the takeaway is that alert design is never finished, but it can be stable and improving if it is tied to use cases and evidence. When alerts are built from behaviors and refined with outcomes, the SOC becomes more efficient over time. As we conclude, remember that actionable alerts are not defined by how alarming they sound, but by how clearly they translate a use case into an observable behavior hypothesis that a human can validate. You start with a use case tied to meaningful risk, restate it as a testable behavior claim, and select dependable evidence sources that can support that claim. You design the alert message as communication, including the behavior description, the key facts, the explicit reason it is suspicious, and the pivot points that support quick investigation. You scope the alert so it fires on situations that justify action, and you set severity based on confidence and business impact, using enrichment to make those judgments accurate. You build alerts around multi-step attacker behaviors because sequences are more meaningful and less noisy than single events, and you include enough context to guide the next validation step. Over time, you refine alerts through feedback without losing sight of the original use case, so tuning improves precision rather than simply hiding noise. If you can think and speak about alerts this way, you are demonstrating the core skill of turning visibility into decisions, which is exactly what SOC operations and this part of the exam are about.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.